Hello, everyone. So I'll just wait for a couple minutes as people keep trickling into the Zoom. We'll begin shortly.
We're live now.
Yeah, I'm just waiting for some others to come in and then we'll get started. Okay, so I'll just begin by doing some introductions. First, let me introduce myself. I'm Brandon Truitt, the head of learning and community engagement at the Zimmerli Art Museum at Rutgers University, New Brunswick. And I'm really thrilled to welcome you all here tonight, or wherever time zone you might be in, for this really exciting artist talk with Renée Stout. As with all program at the Zimmerli, I'll begin by reading our land acknowledgement to acknowledge where this program originates. So we acknowledge that the land on which we stand is the ancestral territory of the Lenape people. We pay respect to the indigenous people throughout the Lenape diaspora, past, present, and future, and honor those that have been historically and systematically disenfranchised. We also acknowledge that Rutgers University, like New Jersey and the United States as a nation, was founded upon the exclusions and erasures of indigenous peoples. So as I was saying tonight, we are really excited to welcome artist Renée Stout for a talk that will in part elaborate on her fascinating artwork, The Black Wall, in 2008, which was recently acquired last year by the Zimmerli and is now displayed in the Art of America's gallery, which I really encourage you to come and see if you haven't already. The Zimmerli's Art of America's gallery presents holdings from the museum's permanent collection, ranging from early portraiture, American portraiture, to contemporary abstraction, and focuses on expanding the scope of American art by highlighting works by artists of color, women, and queer people who have been historically neglected and marginalized in dominant accounts of art history. And tonight's program coincides with a grant fund initiative sponsored by the Art Bridges Foundation, which has made tonight's talk possible and facilitated 2 loan artworks by Black artists to be featured previously in the gallery, including Barclay Hendricks' painting Brenda P. from 1975. And in that gallery now we're very fortunate to have Renée Stout's The Black Wall 2008 installed in that same location. So let me introduce Renée. Her work explores a long history of African-American experience across the diaspora, its movement through the subjection of the transatlantic slave trade, its displacement into colonies throughout the Americas, and to everyday life in disparate places like Pittsburgh, New Orleans, and Washington, D.C. Her artworks are in fact manifestations of years of intensive research that she conducts into our history and spiritual traditions like hoodoo and other practices throughout the African diaspora. She often inhabits the alter ego named Fatima Mayfield, who is a worker of magic and featured in the artwork The Black Wall, which, as I've said, is now in the Zimmerli. As I'm sure she will elaborate throughout her presentation today, Stout is known for working across a wide range of media to combine the tradition of Trump FX with similar practices that dismantle the very notion of or constraints that posit art as inhabiting a singular medium. Stout is the first American artist to exhibit in the Smithsonian's National Museum of African Art at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., and her traveling museum exhibition, Tales of a Conjure Woman, which originated at the Housley Institute of Contemporary Art in Charleston, South Carolina, was accompanied by a major monograph and was named one of the top 10 exhibitions of 2017 by Hyperallergic. Stout has also been the recipient of awards from the Paula Krasner Foundation, the Joan Mitchell Foundation, the Bader Fund, the Lewis Comfort Timpany Foundation, and the Driscoll Prize awarded by the High Museum of Art, among many others. So in addition to the Zimmerli Art Museum, Stout's work is included in many public collections across the United States. And I think today, as Renée has already told me, we'll be talking about works from her most recent show, Navigating the Abyss, which is now on view at the Mark Strauss Gallery, or was recently on view in the Mark Strauss Gallery in New York City. So before I bring Renee to continue her presentation, just want to let you know that we'll have Q&A starting around 7:40 Eastern time. So please use the Q&A feature of the webinar to pose your questions, and you can do so throughout as we are talking, and we'll address them, as many as we can throughout Renee's presentation. So I guess we'll get started, Renee, and I'll share your presentation and we'll get going.
Thank you for that introduction, Brandon.
No problem.
Okay.
Okay. Let me go.
I don't want them to see it all yet.
No, sorry, well, let me get up to the front.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry.
Okay. All right. So you don't have an image of Brenda P that's in the collection, do you, by Barclay Hendricks? Because if I would have thought about it, I would have included it along with this one right here. You know, Claire had told me that they wanted me to address the painting by Barclay that's in the exhibition, especially since my black wall is in dialogue with it in the show right now that's up. And I looked at Barclay's statement about, you know, that he paints what's in front of him, and the idea that, you know, I can relate to that because, you know, within the community that I live in, that's my first interest in recording what's in front of me. And back when I first moved to Washington, D.C. in 1985, I was a young artist. I wasn't a professional artist at that time. So when I moved here, I had a day job at both a Montessori school and thrift stores and things like that. But it was at a time when I was really discovering who I am as a person and trying to figure out my place in the world. So my early work was a lot about, you know, identity and establishing what my identity was, while at the same time trying to figure out who I was, you know, my authentic self that wasn't sort of influenced by what my parents wanted me to be, or what my society expected women to be. I would say that my whole career has been shedding or resisting those kinds of assignments from society and parents so that I could, you know, live a life as a self-actualized person, deciding who I am and who I need to be. So when I moved to DC in 1985, and moving around and going to museums and doing everything like that, I discovered this spiritual supply store, and the woman's name was Miss Mayfield. I didn't know her first name. And the store was full of herbs and roots and powders and, you know, talismans. And, you know, it was a very fascinating place. And I knew it was kind of an intersection between the diasporic belief systems that had their seeds in African societies, and also those traditional belief systems that place was kind of like a vortex for those things. And it was so powerful for me to discover that. And so it was interesting because along with discovering that spiritual supply store, you know, I was exposed to the wonderful Museum of African Art here in DC that is so rich in, you know, things from the, you know, various African countries on the continent. And I just started making all these connections about who I was as an African-American person and what these things meant to me and my ancestors. So I would think that around that time, that's when my work was really about identity. And so at some point, I established a sort of alter ego that allowed me to create a narrative of this unfolding of self-discovery. And I called her Fatima Mayfield. You know, the Mayfield came from the woman who was the proprietor at the root store, but Fatima was a woman who was in one of the neighborhoods that I lived in at some point in the 90s. And so this is Fatima Mayfield. And, you know, around this area, they have these signs that were made by this place in Baltimore called Globe Advertising, I think it was. And they would advertise concerts that would be in the area. So I decided to make a Globe poster based on this fictitious root woman, seer, spiritual advisor that became my alter ego, that was a vehicle for me to go on this journey of self-actualization. So this is an image of Fatima. Now, as you notice, she has like straight hair in here. And if you see other images of Fatima, she may have dreadlocks, she may have, this straight hair. This is one of her wigs, because what she does is she sort of morphs like a chameleon to deal with whatever clients she has to deal with. And in the African-American community, sometimes older generations have a hard time with dreadlocks. So it's about hair, and all these other issues and things that arise in the African-American community. So Fatima used the wig to advertise her services so that she doesn't scare off any of the older generation that doesn't quite understand, dreadlocks. So there's a lot of like sort of symbolism and imagery that's kind of unique to the African-American community that I'm dealing with as well. So I just wanted to talk about this slide right here for a while, just so it establishes the kind of sort of mindset that I'm in as I create the rest of the work that you'll see. And the reason why I wanted this image here is because, to me, it has the same kind of attitude as Brenda P., where you have this self-assured woman who, when I painted it, I read the statement that was made about Barclay Hendricks's Brenda P. And in some ways, it's not his statement, but it was a statement written by a curator or whoever. But I like to think that Barclay, like me, when he creates an image of an African-American person, he's not really doing it thinking about, okay, I have to portray an African-American person because, we have been neglected and not really pictured in European, in European art history and that kind of thing. I don't think he went into it thinking about that. Just like I don't wake up in the morning thinking that I'm a Black person and I need to explain myself every day. I don't want to explain myself every day. I don't need to explain myself every day. Like Barclay, I paint what's in front of me and what interests me. And to create a person like this that's been influenced, Fatima Mayfield, by a woman I encountered in my community is all I was thinking about when I was doing it. A woman who embraces African-American and African traditions and is of service to her community. That's what I was thinking when I painted this. So that is, my introduction to Fatima Mayfield. So now we can move to the next slide.
Thank you. That's great.
So, in this narrative that's going on in my head, I really do have like this movie playing out in my head where Fatima Mayfield was, and sometimes is, the protagonist. And she represents a lot of things. She's a self-assured woman. She knows who she is. She makes no apologies. She just lives her life. But she is a woman who is a hoodoo priestess and interested in being of support to her community. So to create a hoodoo house is like the scene where this movie plays out. So every once in a while, I'll, in my work, hint at a facade of this house. So there's never the whole house is depicted, but just like these bits and pieces of it. So this is the hoodoo house. And it was kind of started in 2014, but recently, for 2022, I tweaked it because it was in a show that was a retrospective sort of Thornton Dowell's work, the self-taught visionary artist Thornton Dowell. And it was in response to, or in dialogue with a piece that he did that was a sculpture of 4 figures called Hoodoo People. So in some ways, I saw this as a dialogue with Thornton, who also encountered Hoodoo people in his Southern environment. So, this is just like making all these connections between Northern culture, Southern culture, and the diaspora in the African continent. Okay, so next slide. Yeah, this is a detail of the hoodoo house. It's, even when I do a facade like that, I feel like it's a sculpture, but at the same time, I treat the surface like a painting. So there's like some, things going on where I'm assembling objects and hanging them on the piece. So it's very like sculptural. It creates a tableau. But like I said, at the same time, as a painter, I'm very concerned with the surface and how I treat, the surface itself. So next slide, which will show you what I mean by that. So, I was trained as a painter. So in this detail of the hoodoo house, you'll see that I painted a water bug crawling up the side of the house and like ivy that's climbing up the side of the house. So I still like drawing on my painting skills, even though I'm doing like 3-dimensional works and tableaus and installations. Next slide. So this is the black wall that the Zimmerli recently acquired. So if you can imagine on the inside of that hoodoo house, there may be a black room that has black walls. And I don't know why I decided to call it, like create these black walls, but in my imagination, it's like a slice of this room was taken out and you see just one section of this black wall. And the black to me is like a metaphor for the mysteries, spiritual mysteries and these connections that, we're still trying to make as African Americans to the African continent and those mysteries that are in between. So Fatima in her black room is sort of, making her connections, doing her searches and that kind of thing. So that's what this represents. And that's an image, that would be an image of her. And you can see she has dreadlocks in this image. And of course, she's modeled after me because I'm my own best model who's going to sit for me when everybody's at work and I'm painting. So I become the model. So in this painting, like I said, I treat it as a tableau, but as a painting as well. So I painted the image of her. And then you see the rooster is actually a painting as well. There's like a collage on the left. There's like another collage down at the bottom. So I use a variety of techniques to create a piece like this. Okay, next slide. And within that environment of that home, she has devices that she uses to connect to the spiritual world. So this is one of the pieces that I made that's a device for, channeling or connecting with spirits. And this is called Spirit Selector. And, in my mind, what she's doing is she's sitting in there and she needs to collect, if she needs to connect to a particular spirit, she turns the dial to find the frequency to that spirit. And there's African spirit names going around, or African deities going around on the dials. Of course, this is a vintage radio body that I found and then proceeded to take, bits of electronics from the past and do sort of a mashup and build upon that to create a whole new device that, you can't really plug it in or anything like that, but it doesn't matter. It becomes this visual so that when a viewer is looking at my work, I want their imagination to wander too, about, how this device could possibly work and how she's connecting to these spirits in her environment. She's on the same frequency with them when she, turns to their name. Next image. And of course, there are roots and products that, I find in some of these spiritual supply stores that I encounter as I go around the country. And High John the Conqueror root is a famous root in African-American lore. And in several blues songs, you'll hear blues musicians mention that they have their High John the Conqueror root, like Muddy Waters has mentioned it in songs and, various other blues musicians. And so there you see High John the Conqueror root down there. And I did a glass residency at Pilchuck Glass School in Washington several years back. And I actually designed these glass jars, and they had gaffers, people who were glass blowers, create your designs for you. So I picked the colors, they blew them for me. And then I sandblasted the letters into the glass. And so I have these jars in my home where I keep the roots. I made these specifically to hold my roots here at home in my herb stash. Next slide. Okay, so imagine that, you know, Fatima's store is closed for the day and one of her clients, you know, needs a root, you know, a High John the Conqueror route for emergencies. Like, you know, maybe they're going to go play the lottery, or, you know, maybe they're gambling somewhere. And High John the Conqueror route is good for gambling. It's good carrying it for protection, to draw love to you. But in this case, you know, what if somebody needed it to go play the lottery or like go to the casino or something like that? So on the outside of her store that I imagine she has, there is a root dispenser that you can go put your 50 cents in, you know, get your High John the Conqueror root, you know, or, you know, perhaps another herb that you might need for something like, you know, a stomach ache or something like that. But this is not a real root, a dispenser that I found and repurposed. It was actually built from wood and things that I had laying around the house. And, you know, the fun part was trying to construct something that looks like it actually works. And so, like, when you look around where it says like the roots and herbs up there, that sign around the top that lists what's inside, you'll notice that it looks a little like dirty and rusty around the edge of that white sign. Well, that's where I draw on my painter skills to create what looks like rust and dirt, you know, in a trompe l'oeil style. So once again, you know, I'm making this three-dimensional object, but I'm still, you know, I'm still a painter at heart. So you got a lot of stuff going on here. I feel like my work is highly conceptual, and I think it's interesting that my work is never described as such by people who are writing about it. But I first consider myself a conceptual artist, and even though, and you know, traditionally conceptual artists, you know, feel like the idea is more important than the physical artwork itself, I feel like my work is still conceptual, but as a visual artist, I still want you to probably like think about the concept that I'm putting forth, but at the same time, I want to engage you visually with the objects that I'm creating and allow your imagination to wander the way mine does when I'm making these things. Okay, next slide. Okay, so about 2015, I was starting to feel like the country was headed in a real weird way. We're going to switch gears here, and I'm going to call the next section of this this talk, because we're halfway through, Navigating the Abyss, which I titled my most recent show at Mark Strauss Gallery in New York, that ran from January 8th of this year until March 5th. But this piece right here was done in 2018, but what I'm, you know, the things that I'm going to talk about all started coming to me in 2015. And it's interesting because I had adopted the alter ego of a seer. And in some weird way, it's like it was a self-fulfilling prophecy, because I started feeling like I was able to see things that were coming. And even when I talked to people about it and tried to explain what I felt, you know, people were like, oh, yeah, you know, whatever, you know, thought I was like weird for saying certain things. And I started feeling around 2014, 15, that something was brewing. Things weren't going right, that it was building up to a point where the country was going to be at a crossroads and probably would not make the right choices, because the concept of the crossroads in like West Africa is where, you know, you have an important decision to make. And so that it's like you're at a crossroads. So sometimes people will literally go to where two roads cross for the symbolism, make an offering. And at a crossroads is supposedly where you can, you know, the mortal plane meets with the spiritual plane, and you can make requests for guidance from ancestors or the spirits, the universe, or whatever, but it's a spiritual force that you're saying, look, I need some guidance. I got an important decision to make. So I felt like the country was at a crossroads and it wasn't going to be good. So this piece was done in 2018 after the 2016 election, and it was confirmed that things went sideways. And so in my show in 2018 that I had here in DC, I did this piece that was based on a song that I kept listening to by Jimi Hendrix, who in 1968 was watching everything go sideways, and probably in the same mindset that I'm in right now, wondering where the country was going to go, and, the madness that was ensuing at that point in time in 1968. And here we are, he had a song that was called If 6 Was 9, If 6 Was 9. And he was speculating, okay, what if things get all turned upside down and turned backwards and sideways? What are we going to do? Well, I'm asking that same question, but what I was in response to Jimi Hendrix, I'm saying when 6 is 9, because everything has been turned upside down. He was speculating back then, and in some ways, he gets the answer to what he was asking, because we're seeing that play out right now. The country's moving backwards in a really crazy way. And I was responding to that in dialogue with Jimi Hendrix and what he was seeing at another tumultuous time in the country's history. So what this actually is behind the wall. You're peeking behind this wall, seeing a ritual take place where the root worker or the seer is communing with the spirits. And that figure to the right represents the deity of the crossroads, who is Elegba or Ishu Elegba. He's also a trickster. But she is consulting with Elegba about where the country is going. And she's burning the incense, she's gathering herbs, she's making offerings, hoping that she can help turn things around. So this is basically allowing the viewer to peek in on a ritual that's going on. And this painting is a larger painting, as you can see, the 48 by 60. I love painting large. I just don't have enough space in my house to paint as large as this all the time. So anyway, this is one of my favorites because I do get a chance to stretch out a bit in this one. Okay, so next slide. So right around the time all this is going on, I've been journaling since I was 17. But when the world started getting crazy, I felt like I needed to divide what I was recording up between 3 different journals. And just around the time COVID hit and things started really getting crazy in 2020, I created a separate journal from my main journal, and I called it the Captain's Log, so that I could record all of the stuff that had been going on, like with the George Floyd murder, the protests all around the world, what was going on here politically, what was going on with COVID, people who had died from, I was, with the mass shootings, all of that was getting recorded in the Captain's Log. Then the spells was like the daily journal where I, wrote the most personal things that I was thinking, emotional stuff and that kind of thing. And then the sketchbook is where, I devised, I come up with the ideas and I record the ideas. So now it's like, I feel like I don't know why I needed to make this separation, because at one point in time, everything just went into one book. The journal and the sketchbook, was all one thing. Now I have to rant in the one, then I have to have quiet and stillness in the one, and just to be. And then the other one is where the creativity plays out. So I got these 3 things going on at one time. Okay, so next slide. So like I was saying, I did this piece in 2019. This was just before, COVID struck, just before George Floyd, just before 2020. I did this piece in the fall of 2019, and it was called What She Sees. And in some ways, I couldn't even explain to you why I did this. I was just blindly acting on a sense of foreboding that I was feeling. And so anytime you see grids, and this is on handmade paper, but I actually penciled in, with colored pencil, the lines and the grid on there. And you see the numbers going up, and those are the years, and it's going up to 2021. And like I said, I did this in 2019. feeling like 2020, 21, like there was going to be some craziness going on. And you can see like the color is almost like, you know, the black is like an explosion or some smoke. To the left of her, like her eye, there's like a reddish area. If you see the piece in person, it's almost like a bloodied wound that has been stitched up. And it was a metaphor for violence. And I didn't know why I did this. I just did it, and I go with it. If I, in my gut, feel like I want to make something, no matter how strange it is and whether I fully know why I'm doing it or not, I just create it. And then to me, as things play out, it's like, oh, that was almost like a sort of a, what do you call it? Not a prophecy, but, you know, just a sense that going with my gut, that I feel vibrations about what's going to happen. And I use my artwork to process those feelings. Okay, so that's what that's about. Next image. So here we are. The jar on the right is a memory jar that I found in a antique store off the beaten path when I was driving from DC to Pittsburgh to visit my parents long time ago. And I love these jars because, you know, they've been done for a long time. They used to be done like in African American culture. The Victorians did them as well, where, you know, they would collect sometimes they would collect the belongings of somebody who passed away and create these jars in memory of these people. The Victorians did it as a pastime in some ways. But in African American culture, sometimes these things were done as grave markers because they couldn't afford grave markers. So they would create jars with shells and different things to, you know, pay homage to the deceased person, and then set the jar on the grave. And these things are called memory jars. And, you know, I think it's an interesting form. I love those, and I'd like to have more, but this is the only one I have right now. But when Uvalde, Texas happened, you know, a while back, you know, a few months back, I was so angry and frustrated, as, you know, many people are, about, you know, the seeming lack of concern on government officials about the loss of life of innocent children just going to school. And so I created a memory jar, and it's called American Memory Jar, because it's one of these things where hopefully 50 years from now, people can look at this and feel ashamed at what we've allowed to happen in this country. What seems to be just like, you know, the just total disregard for life that has been normalized, and it's very frustrating to watch. And you know, there's no way that I'm going to let this moment pass without marking it with something to be left behind for people, you know, when we come to our senses at some point, to understand how horrific these times actually are. And it was interesting because this was kind of a Rorschach test, because this was in my most recent show. And it was interesting how, you know, in my mind, I just wanted the color to be uniform, just as a form. So, you know, it's not colorful at all. It's very stark in its, you know, in the dark color with the guns. And, you know, you see the cross that has like, it's rhinestone, so it's sparkled in the lights in the gallery, you know, so it's that slogan. It's a metaphor for that slogan, how, you know, some of these people want to say guns and God, and you think, oh my God, you know, who says that? But it was interesting how some people only saw it because it was Black as an African American child, and then saw it as something negative, you know, based on something else, and went in a whole nother direction, when really this piece was about all children who die before their time. So I thought that was quite interesting, how color, you know, made the difference about in the way some people perceived this piece. Next slide. This piece was done around the time that Ketanji Brown Jackson was being confirmed as a Supreme Court justice. And I was so pissed at how she was being treated, but so proud of her for having the poise and the restraint to get through it, which shows that she's much better than the people who were questioning her. And this was based on an African figure, a traditional African figure called an Ikenga. And the interesting thing about this figure is that these figures are usually young males will have these figures. This one happens to be female, but in the Igbo culture, these figures will be created for a young male, and they're used as a focal object for him to focus on the achievements he wants to reach in life. And so he will have this on an altar in his home, and bring offerings and focus on, his success and, move himself in the direction of the goals that he sees for himself in his head. Well, the interesting thing is I found this at a flea market here in DC, and I got it from an African vendor who sells, African art that's not really traditional in that it's been used or it was really, involved in ceremonies. They're just being sold as import, that's based on traditional stuff. But I thought it was interesting that it happened to be a female one because you rarely see one that's in the form of a female. So she had been floating them around my house for years, and I would look at it. And then one day, around the time that Ketanji Brown Jackson was being confirmed, I decided I wanted to alter the piece and create basically a weapon for her and women to fight back, for their freedom and the way women are treated in this culture. So I lopped off the horns because they were pointed, and I turned them into gun barrels. I lopped off the breast and turned them into gun barrels. And if you see around her waist, like you see in the back, she has bullets and handcuffs. And then this power pack on the back of her is a gauge that I attached to the piece. And when I found the piece, it was like not in such great condition. So I actually resurfaced it and put this writing called Insibity, this West African writing called Insibity all over her. And I specifically chose the symbols, and I have a sort of key that tells you what each symbol means that I painted on her body. So she becomes this kind of power object or sort of defense weapon for women. Okay, next slide. And this was an installation view of my show at the Mark Strauss Gallery. And you see, I love the juxtaposition of these three pieces in the gallery at this angle, because that facade in the background is called Storefront Church, Georgia Avenue, and it's an homage to the 9 African Americans who were killed in the church by Dylan Roof in Charleston, South Carolina. So once again, the gun violence continues, and that, all these things, are together in that exhibition. Next slide. And I know who the culprits are. I know who the villains are in the story. And so you can recognize a familiar person in there. This is called the learning, because at some point in time, these people are really going to have to answer for what they've been doing and how destructive they've been to our society. It's only a matter of time. So this is me interacting with Alegbo, who's the deity of the crossroads, and asking him, why do people have to learn their lessons so hard? And he's like, I don't know, but they're going to learn today. So we see whose head is on the, is attached to a big blowhard. His head is like a balloon attached to a string. But anyway, so next image. And back in, I would say maybe 2018, maybe before then, it was before then, I started making, because I saw what was happening, I started making these drawings called escape plans. And they started with escape plan A, escape plan B. And in my mind, it's just trying to get off of this plane sometimes, just for a moment, to have the peace and the space to be, because I have a mind that doesn't stop. I'm always connecting the dots about an event over here, an event over, and an event over here, and something happening, and how these things are all related, even though they're seemingly unrelated, which is why you see those blue lines all having these dots where these things connect. That's the idea of me watching what's going on and connecting everything and seeing how this whole thing is playing out. And there's my high John root at the top there for protection and guidance and that kind of thing. So the first version of this was a drawing on paper that wasn't very big. And I liked the drawing so much that I decided to translate it into a painting last year. So, I've been venturing off into like sort of more an abstract way of approaching my ideas sometimes. And Sean Scully, the painter Sean Scully, kind of nudged me to do that. So I sort of play around with, abstraction and realism. I think that I'll never be a totally abstract painter. There's always going to be a balance of abstract and realism. In this particular painting, there's kind of a horizon you'll see going across there. It's almost like I'm imagining a place that I would rather be and that I'm focusing on. Next slide. So headed off towards that horizon, there's kind of a storm that I encounter. And this was the painting that was named after, well, the show itself was named after this particular painting called Navigating the Abyss with Coordinates. I feel like we're just at this place right now where we don't know where this is all headed. We don't know what the outcomes will be. And I feel like we're standing on the edge of this abyss where there's just this, you don't know what's happening. But at the same time, I have to function, I have to go on. And I feel like in some ways I have a lot of guidance from, I don't know if it's ancestors, I don't know who it is. That's why the coordinates are there. It's almost like somebody's feeding me information to stay on course, do what I need to do. It's like, yeah, it's going to be rocky, but you have to navigate the abyss. So you have to keep going. And so that's what this is. That's why I called the painting Navigating the Abyss, because that's what I'm doing. Next slide. And this is the last image. And this is called 1 Million Miles from the Ground. And basically, it's about reaching a space where there are infinite possibilities, it's quiet, and like Sun Ra used to like to say, space is the place. It's like it's open, it's, infinite. And I just feel like once I get past the abyss, this is where I am. And 1 Million Miles from the Ground is inspired. It's a song title of a song that's really peaceful. It's actually a love song. And whenever I hear the song, it just makes me envision something like this, like just a space that's really quiet and where you can just be. That's it.
Thank you so much, Renee. That was really an incredible tour through your really amazing work. Thanks so much. So I'm going to wait for some questions to come through, but while we wait for some questions from the audience, I thought I might ask you also, I'm just like really excited you mentioned Sun Ra in the very end. I'm kind of curious, and the way that you talk about your work and across like so much experimentation through different media and yourself as a conceptual artist, how do you see yourself alongside other artists that really like, it's hard to talk about even like Sun Ra in terms of a one medium because of the costumes, the orchestra,
right?
Like all of like, even he, I would think is like a kind of conceptual artist, the way that he would talk about himself as like from another planet. Like he believed that, and like you have to believe that to be to even like watch the movie The Space is the Place, or so like I guess like because space is the place, right? It's both the sentence and an assertion, right? I don't know, just kind of like thinking along that way. How do you see yourself in alongside that lineage of artists, like Sun Ra and these kind of conceptual Black artists?
It's like not just Sun Ra, but then somebody like Gerhard Richter, who doesn't stick with one medium, doesn't want to be pinned down. I feel like, if my mind could conceive of these things, there's no reason why I have to fit into a category to make it easy for the art world. So in some weird way, like a child, I let my imagination run free and I'll, experiment with whatever I want to experiment with. But then the art world can't take that. And it's like, if I can't categorize you, I don't know what to do with you. And it's like, so, I've had that affect my career in some weird way, but I'm not going to stop doing things the way that I'm doing them because it's just the way I need to express myself. So I think that somebody like Sun Ra, which is why I'm fascinated by him, which is like what you were saying with the costumes, I came of age with George Clinton in the mothership. I saw the concert where they had created an actual spaceship to make it look like it landed on the stage and he came out of it, and so that performance aspect that goes along with the music, and then Sun Ra trying to get people to imagine that this thing that we're in right here that we all feel like a little oppressed by, let's let our imaginations escape this. And that's what he was saying, and that's what I'm saying.
That's great. Why don't we, you mind if we turn back to the Black Wall to talk a bit more about it?
Sure.
Because we have these images, I'd like to kind of use them to kind of locate us. But just like that, the way you're talking about, I know that's a question about the Black Wall that we might turn to. So Donna asks here, what is the significance of the hand with the light shining from the palm, for instance?
It's almost like taking an oath. It's like telling the ancestors that she's going to fulfill their work and their mission. Each generation has to move, every other generation forward. And so that's what she's doing. She's taking an oath.
That's great.
And the light may be spirits. I don't know, like she's connecting with the spirits.
Yeah.
Sometimes I don't know why I do these things, it's like, but I know the hand up was the oath, but is that sort of orb, some spiritual energy?
Yeah, why don't we stick with it? I know there's another kind of question just to kind of talk more about like components of the work. I'm also curious because the way you talked about on the slide with your different kind of writing practices that you've been carrying on for your life. I'm curious about the use of text. So we have some text here. I wish we have a couple details that you have in the PowerPoint, but where does the text come from? How do you create the language that we see here?
Well, I don't think a lot of people know this, but I'm also a writer. And it's funny, the things that have been published was basically one short story and 5 essays that I've written on artist work. Like I wrote one on Sean Scully, I wrote one on Bill Christenberry, that's been published, Fred Mershimer, a variety of artists that I've written about, and I love writing. And a while back, like let's say the mid to late 90s, was a really wonderful time in DC as far as the poetry scene. It was like really a vibrant poetry scene back then. And I was dating a poet at the time, and I would go to the poetry readings at, local cafes and things like that. And at some point, I got the idea to have some poets come and workshop their poems in my studio. And they would workshop at a table in a room that was next to my studio. So I'd be piddling around in the studio and I'd be listening to them critique each other's work and talk about the way poetry functions. And they influenced me in talking about text and, how words could be powerful and that kind of thing. And so, we had a talk one night and they were like, there's no reason why you can't put text in your work. It extends the metaphor in your work. You're doing something visually, but if you felt like putting text in it, it takes the viewer to another place. And so that's what happened. At some point in time, I started realizing that I could extend the metaphor of the work with text.
That's a really lovely way of putting it. I love the idea of the like artwork as metaphor, which metaphor, of course, is a way of like transporting us to another world, right? By
Exactly.
things. So I know like also like, how do you think about this work in like as a kind of assemblage maybe, or like if that's a word that's useful for you to talk about the artwork? Like for example, I'm kind of like always drawn when I was looking at this again today in the Zimmerli, the bottles on the top, the vials. So, which kind of brings us, I know that you said the wall is a kind of way of like kind of cut out of a room.
Yeah.
And then also kind of on top of the room, right? Of the cutout, like where the vials are. So I kind of want to maybe you could talk a little about what the vials are doing, why they're not in like the actual kind of like boundaries of the wall, but they're kind of also above it.
Okay, because once again, the idea of that being too literal, like, it's like they are with the wall, these are some of the things that may be found in that room. But to me, this is where I'm like the child that says they don't literally have to be in the room. They're suggested that they're in the room because they're on the top of this piece.
Yeah.
You
No,
know,
I hear you. And it's it's this like way again, like the way you kind of ended with Sun Ra, like way I think about you alongside his work is we are transported, right, into a kind of like world that is like strange, estranged from like reality in different ways.
yeah.
And the kind of different components of this do that work to kind of get us outside of a reality that seems familiar, you know?
Right, exactly, exactly. Because, it's like very rarely do you imagine like this whole black room with a texture on it like that. And what are these weird things that are on the wall? I imagine a room like this, and maybe one day I'll do an installation where I transform a room with 4 walls and have things all over it like this. I can see that.
I love that.
And then it's my work is also very playful and humorous. And I think that people sometimes don't get that level of it. Like, for example, do you see the little shelf that's just under the portrait?
Mhm.
And there are 2 bottles.
Right.
Well, the bottle on the left has the class picture of a guy named Beetle that was in high school with me that I used to have a crush on, right? So the pieces almost become these weird time capsules too, that I insert pieces of my life and memories into.
That's wonderful. I was about to ask about that, but also there's another question about like this work just seems so like intense in terms of the labor that might have went into it. So I wonder if you talk about like how long this took to create, like what was the process of creating it?
You know, the work is really labor intensive, and it's hard to say how long something like this took, because what happens is I'll start a piece like this, but I'll work on 3 pieces, usually 3 simultaneously. And I'll just keep working around until each one is complete. Because to me, sometimes I might get to a point in something where, okay, I don't know what I want to do next on this, or where I'm going to take, how I'm going to, what's the next thing I need to do? Let me go work over here and, on this piece over here. And then all of a sudden you'll start to resolve the other piece you were working on. You come back to it with some resolution, you move on, and so that's the way I'm used to working now. It was only, it was like a long, long time ago where I used to start something, finish it, start something, finish it. You know what I mean? I don't work in a linear way like that anymore. It's more like, just working around in a circle on a few pieces at a time. And so it's hard to say how long something like this would take, but yeah, my work is labor intensive, which is why I never feel like I'm very prolific. I feel like it takes a long time in some ways to do all these little things in one piece.
I have to say that you showed us a lot of work today, which is I think quite prolific and really incredible. Um, another question while we stick on this painting or work is why does Fatima look to the side?
I don't know. There were times when she's looking at the viewer when I depict her in a work of art. And then sometimes she's off in a moment of reverie. I don't know why she's looking off to the side in this one.
I mean, in some ways, I think it makes me think that the kind of eyesight brings us to another component of the work. I mean, this is like one when I'm in the gallery looking at it, I'm just like, you're kind of brought all around, and it's kind of like, where does your eye land, and like, where is your attention drawn? And in some ways, her eyes brings us to the kind of rooster and
Yeah,
and it's like also that it's on top of the wall, so
yeah,
you're also another component.
yeah.
And
Oh yeah,
then
no, that's one of my lessons I remember from art school, how to make the person's eye go around in a piece, areas of rest, where, and things like that.
let me see what other questions we have. What about other artistic influences that have been really important to you? We talked about a few. You mentioned Sean Scully. We talked about Sun Ra.
Yeah, I have lots of influences at various times and stages in my development of my career. And I would say very, very early on, I think it was, Joseph Cornell, Betty Saar, Ed Keen Holtz, definitely African, ceremonial ritual art. Those were my major influences early on. But then I think what began to influence me, like I said, was, trying to figure out who I was as a person and spiritually, diving into African American spiritual belief systems. It's like when I look at abstract art, even though it's very different than what I do, a lot of people would be very surprised to know that some of my favorite artists are, abstract artists, and that even when I'm making my own artwork, sometimes there are areas of the work that after it's done, I mean, it's not like I'm consciously doing it, but when it's done, it's like, man, I could take this section right here and just remove everything else, and it would be the greatest abstract painting. And that's funny because that's how Sean came to, challenge me to do abstract work. He saw a realistic painting that I did, but off to the side, in some certain areas, he's like, she'd be a good abstract painter. So I do like to dabble with that and actually consciously try to do it sometimes. But like I said, I feel like I'm such a realist painter because that's where, I started, that's going to always be in me. And and I'm not going to fight it. I'm not going to fight. That's who I am. So I'll let that come out when it needs to.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just kind of remembering now when you kind of early in your presentation about the way you talked about the surface, you treat the surface of the work. I think when you're talking about the black wall, like a painting.
Yeah, it was
And
the Hoodoo House. Yeah.
yeah, the Hoodoo House, the one before this one.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could maybe say a little more about that. Let me get back to it. So this one kind of also is very similar. I guess maybe thinking about the black wall connection with this work, but more about like thinking about the surface, like a painting. This one also has so much, like, to me, a lot of like abstract kind of uses of like representation.
Definitely. Yeah, this is very related to the black wall in that it was approached in a similar way, and that I was concerned with the surface, and then I started, adding objects on that interacted with the surface, the things that are going on the surface, and going back and forth between the two-dimensional and the three-dimensional, how they work together. So yeah, this is definitely got some abstract qualities to it. This one, I was probably more aware of pushing some abstract qualities of the work, even though you stand back off of it and you get the sense of that it's, part of the facade of a house. When you get up on it and you start looking at the detail, you get into, the way certain colors come together and certain things that are going on the surface.
Yeah, that's great. So we have maybe we have time for one more question. We're about to hit 8. So on this one, there's another question about the significance of numbers, since they appear in many of your paintings, and we have a series of 2s here. Anything about that?
You want to go to the next image? Because I think it actually gives a close-up. Oh, the 222. Okay, yeah.
Oh yeah, the 222 under, like,
So the
near
222 is a lucky number for me.
Okay.
For whatever reason, whenever I see 222, it's going to be a good day. Whether I see it on the digital clock on my stove, or there's a truck going by, going down the street as I'm driving around and I see 222 on the side of it, I'm like, it's going to be a good day. And it usually is. So it's always been a good number for me. And the reason why is because way back when I was still living in my parents' house, for whatever reason, I think I was in the kitchen doing the dishes and I happened to look at the clock and it said 222. And I just like the way the number looks. So my father walks in and I say, you know what? You should go play 222 today. And so he's like, okay. So my father gets all distracted. Later on, it's around 7 o'clock when they were drawing the lottery. We're watching, the news and local news, and they draw the lottery after that. And 222 came up that day. And I hear my father and mother, and he's like, oh man, Renee told me to play that number today. Ever since then, it's been my favorite number.
That's great. So it's hearing that when you bring us to the attention to like the personal, like in your works, that like as a viewer who may not know you, like wouldn't be able to really have that context. Do you
No,
want to talk about maybe also the detail here with these numbers, and we can maybe have that be
yeah,
really
like for example, 1207 is my family home that I grew up in. 13 I was born on February 13th. 1916 is my paternal grandmother's year of birth, who I always feel like is guiding me. Her spirit is guiding me. So sometimes numbers will come up like that, where I'm just having memories as I'm working, and I want, I can make random marks sometimes, but then they do have meaning too. I just felt like I needed to put those numbers on there because I was actually, if you see down the side to the right, there are all these numbers, but you can't really see it because the slide, it's not real clear, but there are these numbers. And I have what's called a numbers book that you go to, like sometimes like some of these spiritual supply stores will have dream books. And each number, if like this, you dream about a shoe, it has a number. So if you dream about a shoe, if you dream about an apple, there's a number to go play for that thing. And I just started listing out of the dream book the numbers. But while I was doing that, I'm putting numbers over here too. Because, sometimes when I go play numbers, I think nothing of playing the family home number 1207.
That's one I know about these books too. That's incredible.
Yeah.
Well, I'm gonna maybe end us here, but also just thank you so much for this really incredible conversation. Thank you all for joining us today, and please stay tuned for future programming at the Zimmerli. And thanks again, Renee, for this really fascinating talk.
Thank you, Brandon. Bye.
Bye. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.